One of the first things that the new National Assembly of France did was issue the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. This was about 6 weeks after the signing of the storming of the Bastille that they signed this into law. So you want to look at this primary source document online and recognize what it was trying to do. And some of the pieces of it will sound eerily familiar because you see the sharing of Enlightenment thought between American and French revolutionaries. So it has pieces like Article number 1 that says men are born and remain free and equal in rights. So it's trying to get rid of the aristocracy and the privileges of the church. Everybody is supposed to be equal. And this goes along with the general slogan of the French Revolution: equality, freedom, and brotherhood. If you see number 6, it's stating that law is the expression of the general will, and that every citizen has a right to participate personally or through his representative. So this is trying to take the power away from the absolute ruler, King Louis XVI, and put it in the hands of the people, at least the male portions of society. Another thing that the revolutionaries were very concerned with was the use of force in order to collect taxes or else punish people who spoke out against King Louis XVI or the regime. So you'll see number 8 says the law shall provide for punishments only as are strictly and obviously necessary. So it's trying to make everyone equal in the eyes of the law and regulate punishment for all. Number 9 might sound familiar. All persons are held innocent until they shall have been proven guilty. It's also trying to ensure freedom of the press and freedom of expression with number 10 and number 11. It doesn't want a king or anyone else to be able to build his own military forces. So number 12 shows you that military forces were supposed to be public. And number 13 provides for a new system of taxation. A common contribution is essential for the maintenance of the public forces and for the cost of administration. And this is the important part, this should be equitably distributed among all the citizens in proportion to their means. So with this Declaration of the Rights of Man, you can see the National Assembly is seizing power away from the king and trying to give it to the people. It's also introducing widespread protections for citizens, male citizens of France. So the next slide with the title Changes Introduced by the National Assembly does summarize the main gist of what you see in the Declarations of the Rights of Man. We've got equality before the law for men, the end of these aristocratic privileges of the church and the nobility. We've got a parliament that's elected, so people have their representatives who are working in the government for the good of all. We have taxes that were levied according to your ability to pay. And it was also trying to stop the local corruption in tax collection, especially, but in the administration as well. So the French Revolution underwent a more radical phase 4 years in, from 1793 to 1794. And we most closely associate this with 2 things, the guillotine and Robespierre, a revolutionary leader. And what happened here is we've got a creation of what was known as the Committee of Public Safety, led by Robespierre, and it accused various sectors of French society of committing treason against the revolution, and those who were accused of treason were beheaded using the guillotine, which became known as the National Razor. You'll also see this more radical phase of the revolution referred to as the Reign of Terror. And the estimate is that approximately 15,000 people were killed using the guillotine during this radical phase. And what this was is we have revolutionary leaders who are dissatisfied with the route the revolution has taken. They think that it isn't going far enough to root out the inequalities in society. And also a lot of what's going on is they want payback. So they've suffered and they want people to die for their suffering. So it becomes a very heightened period of tension during the French Revolution, and actually a number of things could get you accused of being an enemy of the revolution. Even, for instance, saying monsieur could get you accused of treason because you were supposed to address other people as citizens to show your equality. So the use of titles, people who wore dresses or pants or other clothing that were seen as too ostentatiously wealthy or dyed in colors that were associated with the nobility faced the guillotine, as did, anybody who seemed to be living more prosperously than the rest. So this turned the revolution into a bloodbath. So not only were members of the aristocracy who tried to remain in France targeted, a lot of them did flee, but also anybody who seemed to be acting, too uppity or too prosperous could also face the guillotine. And if you watch that video about the coroner's report from the History Channel, he talks about the guillotine and why it was invented and what it was supposed to do. So these executions by guillotine during this radical phase of the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror, were public, and not attending one could get you called out as treasonous, and you might face the guillotine yourself for that, for your absence. But over time, about a 2-year period of time, people get really sickened by this constant death and the constant fear of accusations. So this reign of terror ends in July of 1794, when, ironically, the members of the Committee of Public Safety and Robespierre himself were sent to the guillotine. And you'll see Robespierre was beheaded on July 28th, 1794. So after the end of this more radical period, we've got a more moderate government from 1795 to 1799. And it again goes back to those more moderate ideals of the French Revolution. They try to encourage trade within Europe by adopting the metric system. They try to finally abolish all pieces of the feudal system. They draw up that comprehensive system of law so that all men can be equal in the law. They end debt imprisonment. They also end slavery in France's colonies, which will be connected to the Haitian Revolution, which we'll talk about on another day. And they establish a nationwide system of public education, extending the privileges of education to all. So this was the Directory, this more moderate government, which sought kind of the middle road, the moderate position between the old monarchy under Louis XVI and this radical period of the Reign of Terror. And it was in power for 4 years or so until Napoleon staged a coup and seized power. While the French Revolution was going on, Napoleon Bonaparte had been leading military ventures in Egypt and Austria and Russia, and he had himself come from a noble background. He'd studied at French military schools and became an officer in the French army. He was so brilliant a military strategist and leader that he was a general by age 24. And while the revolution had gone on, he had driven Austrian forces from northern Italy to make French claims in that region. He'd invaded Egypt, and that's his most famous defeat until we get to Waterloo in 1798. And he returned during that period of the moderate from 1795 to 1799 and overthrew the Directory. He imposed a new constitution, and in 1802, he named himself consul for life. So the things you want to recognize about Napoleon's rule is that it was authoritarian. So the representative government that had been set up by the French revolutionaries was thrown out the window. He made himself the absolute dictator or ruler, authoritarian ruler of France. He did support some principles of equality. So probably the best example of this was the Napoleonic Code. And this was, again, a very comprehensive system of laws that affirmed the political and legal equality of all adult men. He also had a system of raises that was based on your merit. So even within the army, people rose to higher position based on how skilled they were. But he withdrew some of the reforms of the revolutionaries. He limited free speech, he censored newspapers, he used secret police, he used propaganda to manipulate opinion. So a lot of those principles, ideologies of the revolutionaries, such as freedom of speech and freedom of press, Napoleon abolished them. So the next slide shows you his expansionist nature. He moved throughout Europe in the early 1800s, And by 1812, he had either forged alliances or conquered a lot of Western Europe. So if you flip to the next slide, you'll see how it's his military ventures in Russia that ultimately lead to his defeat. There's a History Channel video, a short video clip, that shows you the decisions he made in Russia that got his troops stuck in the middle of winter so that a number of them froze to death and starved to death. And this significantly weakened Napoleon and gave his enemies, the British, the Austrians, the Prussians, and the Russians, enough time to organize, converge on France, and force him to abdicate in 1814. So this coalition tried to restore the French monarchy. They exiled Napoleon to Elba, but infamously, Napoleon escaped and returned to France in March of 1815. He ruled for another 100 days before the British army defeated him at Waterloo in Belgium. And this time around, he was banished to a more remote location, the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean, where he died from natural causes in 1821. So after the defeat of Napoleon, these victors, primarily the Russians, British, and Austrians, met at the Congress of Vienna, and they had in mind that they needed to reestablish the balance of power in Europe by redrawing some of the boundaries and restoring the power of monarchs who'd been pushed off the throne by Napoleon. So they took back the land that Napoleon had conquered and redistributed it. They also tried to put those monarchs back on the throne everywhere, and their intention was to make further revolution impossible. So Prince Metternich of Austria in 1815 at this Congress of Vienna infamously said, "We have Europe's map for all eternity." Although apparently all eternity is only about 15-20 years. Because we're going to have further revolution and revolts that discards some of the things put in place by the Congress of Vienna. So we have liberals, such as our French revolutionaries, who are coalescing and pushing for more representation in government. We're also going to have even more radical political parties and groups who want rights for workers and a reorganization of states and property. And these conservative forces, these aristocrats and these monarchs, are going to have to deal with liberals and radicals through the course of the 1800s. And over time, they're going to make some concessions so that we have more representative government and better working and living conditions for everybody. So the mindset of our 19th century conservatives is that they viewed history as a continuum. They didn't want change. They wanted things to be the same way they'd been for generations because, of course, through those generations, their families had been in power. They rejected the ideas of revolutionaries in both the Americas and the French Revolution that were saying we should have contractual government, these ideas of Enlightenment thinkers. They rejected those. They thought that the basis of government was God-given, that God had determined who should be the monarchs, and they valued stability and longevity. They did not think that change would create a better society. And overall, they embraced the hierarchies of society because they were at the top. They thought that naturally, organically, society was supposed to be hierarchical, and they rejected the idea that all men should be equal under the law. So with this Congress of Vienna in 1815, we have conservatives back in power. We've got monarchs back on the throne. We've got the lines redrawn in Europe. But these conservative forces, these monarchs and these aristocrats, are going to face challenges from below that over time erode their power.